17-year-old Marcus Williams clutched his first-class boarding pass as three flight attendants surrounded him like wolves. "Excuse me, sweetheart." The lead attendant's voice dripped false kindness. "This seat isn't for people like you." Marcus's jaw tightened as his navy blazer, pressed Oxford shirt, and leather briefcase meant nothing to her scrutinizing eyes. Gate A7 buzzed with passengers pulling out phones, sensing blood in the water. "Ma'am, my ticket shows seat 2A. His voice stayed level despite the heat crawling up his neck, but she examined his boarding pass like a counterfeit bill. "There must be some mistake. Did someone give this to you?" The question hung in the recycled airport air while other passengers watched, some filming, others pretending not to notice this familiar theater of humiliation. Marcus had lived this moment before in different settings, but today felt different somehow. Have you ever watched real-life stories unfold where dignity gets stripped away in public? These black stories remind us how touching stories of discrimination still happen, turning ordinary moments into touching stories that expose the reality behind our everyday interactions. 6:47 p.m. Flight 447, Gate A7. Marcus presented his ticket for seat 2A, purchased by Williams Industries. Lead flight attendant Sarah Morgan examined it like evidence at a crime scene, her professional smile cracking. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion here," she said, voice honey-sweet with underlying steel. "Brad, could you assist me, please?" Manager Brad Thompson appeared within seconds, his wrinkled tie and nervous energy suggesting this wasn't his first crisis today. He studied Marcus's documentation with the intensity of a fraud investigator. ID photo against face, credit card receipt scrutinized for alterations, boarding pass held up to fluorescent lighting. "Look, son, I don't know who sold you this ticket, but someone's taken advantage of you. First-class seats cost more than most cars." Marcus remained perfectly still in seat 2A, his navy blazer immaculate despite the growing chaos around him. "Sir, the purchase was legitimate. Williams Industries has an account with Atlantic Airlines." But Morgan had already moved past, listening, dismissing his expensive watch with a practiced eye. "Honey, you can buy convincing knockoffs anywhere these days." She'd seen this before, kids with fake designer items trying to scam their way into premium cabins. The situation gained momentum like a runaway train. Thompson radioed dispatch while Marcus calmly opened his laptop, revealing files stamped with corporate logos and confidential markings. But the crew was already committed to their narrative. Gate Agent Mills arrived with her clipboard, consulting databases and cross-referencing passenger manifests. Every protocol seemed to confirm their suspicions about the impeccably dressed teenager who spoke too calmly for someone caught in fraud. "Departure in 12 minutes, announced the gate system. A woman in row 8 began recording discreetly, sensing the kind of moment that breaks the internet by morning. Marcus made a quiet phone call that should have changed everything. "The Atlantic Airlines situation is developing as expected. Yes, sir, I have the partnership files with me." But Thompson was too focused on his radio chatter to process the significance of those words. Mills returned with reinforcements. 2 airport security officers whose presence transformed curious onlookers into active witnesses. "We've got a minor with suspicious documentation trying to board first class," Thompson explained to Officer Rodriguez. The irony that Officer Williams shared Marcus's surname wouldn't register until much later, when lawyers were taking depositions and reviewing footage frame by frame. Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate precision, every movement measured and purposeful. His phone displayed multiple incoming calls from numbers with 202 area codes, but he let them go to voicemail. Instead, he placed one outgoing call, speaking barely above a whisper. "Dad, it's happening again." "Gate A7, Atlantic Airlines." The response lasted exactly 15 seconds, after which Marcus nodded once and said, "Perfect timing." "Departure in 8 minutes." The countdown added urgency that benefited everyone except Marcus, who seemed immune to time pressure. Morgan announced a minor delay over the intercom, her voice professionally cheerful despite the circus surrounding seat 2A. Thompson worried about involving headquarters. District managers asking questions, passenger complaints, potential social media fallout. Better to handle this quietly at gate level. Officer Williams approached with textbook authority, though something about Marcus's composure gave him pause. Most teenagers would be tearful, defensive, calling frantically for parents. This one sat like he owned the airline, reviewing documents with the casual interest of someone reading a magazine. "Son, we need to resolve this situation before departure." Marcus gathered his papers methodically, ignoring the growing crowd of smartphone cameras. "Officer, I appreciate your professionalism. This is obviously a misunderstanding that will be cleared up shortly." His tone carried no fear, no anger, just quiet certainty that made everyone uncomfortable. Thompson interpreted this as teenage bravado. Rich kids always thought daddy's money could fix everything. "Listen, kid," Thompson's patience finally snapped. "Whoever bought you this ticket as a prank, it's not funny anymore. Company policy is company policy, and you don't belong in first class." Marcus stood slowly, briefcase in hand, and checked his watch with the satisfied expression of someone whose schedule was proceeding perfectly. Around them, passengers whispered and filmed, sensing they were witnessing something significant without understanding what. The recording passenger captured everything. Morgan's dismissive gestures, Thompson's growing frustration, Marcus's unnatural calm in the face of public humiliation. Her audience was growing, people sharing the stream as another example of discrimination in real time. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the social media storm brewing around him, focused instead on something only he could see. 4 minutes until departure. The gate area hummed with tension as crew members positioned themselves for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. Marcus had complied with every request, answered every question, provided documentation for every challenge. Yet his cooperation felt more ominous than resistance would have been. "We're going to need you to come with us now," Officer Rodriguez announced, though his colleague Williams still seemed hesitant. Marcus nodded agreeably, shouldering his briefcase with the same calm that had unnerved everyone from the beginning. "Of course, officers. Though I should mention, someone very important is going to want a detailed report about today's events." Thompson relaxed slightly, recognizing empty teenage threats. "Sure, kid, have your parents call customer service. They can file a complaint like everyone else." Marcus smiled at that response, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since sitting down. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, and this time he answered immediately. "Hello, this is Marcus Williams. Yes, sir, everything is proceeding exactly as we discussed." 6:52 p.m. 7 minutes to departure. Marcus's phone call ended abruptly when Thompson snatched the device mid-conversation. "Sir, this is Brad Thompson, gate manager for Atlantic Airlines. Your son has suspicious documentation and must be removed immediately." The silence stretched for exactly 5 seconds before a measured voice responded, "Mr. Thompson, you're making a serious mistake." The line went dead, leaving Thompson holding a phone that suddenly felt dangerous. Chen appeared beside him, face pale with new information. "Brad, headquarters just called asking about a priority passenger situation. How did they know anything happened?" Thompson's stomach lurched as he realized their quiet gate-level problem had somehow reached corporate attention within minutes. Someone with serious influence was already pulling strings behind the scenes. Marcus calmly retrieved his phone, checking messages with the casual interest of someone reading weather updates. His demeanor remained unnaturally composed for a teenager facing public humiliation and potential arrest. Officer Rodriguez positioned himself for escalation, while his partner Williams studied the young man who seemed immune to pressure that would break most adults. "Departure in 5 minutes." The announcement echoed through a cabin where passengers had abandoned pretense of privacy. Smartphones captured every angle as Marcus stood slowly, adjusting his blazer like someone preparing for a board meeting rather than removal by security. The live-streaming passenger whispered to her growing audience, "This kid is either completely delusional or playing a game none of us understand." Mills returned with her tablet, sweat visible despite air conditioning. Brad, the credit check came back clean. Williams Industries shows an active account with substantial credit history. Thompson felt his confidence crack as each verification contradicted their fraud theory, but momentum had carried them too far for graceful retreat. Backing down now meant admitting systematic error in front of hundreds of recording witnesses. Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, placing it beside him without opening it. "That contains confidential business documents," he said quietly. "Photographing those papers without authorization could create legal complications for Atlantic Airlines." His tone carried no threats, just matter-of-fact observation that made everyone suddenly conscious of their recording devices. Officer Williams finally engaged directly. "Son, if you have legitimate business here, why not explain the situation clearly from the beginning?" Marcus smiled with what looked like genuine amusement. "Officer, would you believe a 17-year-old claiming corporate authority? Or would you assume he was fabricating stories to avoid consequences?" The logic was uncomfortable and undeniable. They'd created conditions where truth would sound like desperate lies. Chen examined Marcus's documentation again, this time noticing details she'd dismissed initially. The credit card wasn't standard plastic, but heavy metal with exclusive banking logos. His driver's license listed an address in an area where homes started at 7 figures. Even his boarding pass showed purchase through corporate travel systems rather than consumer websites. Each detail individually meant nothing, but collectively they painted a picture none of them wanted to acknowledge. "Departure in 3 minutes." The countdown became a drumbeat of mounting pressure as Thompson radioed for supervisory backup, finally admitting gate-level authority might be insufficient. But Marcus was checking his watch with the satisfaction of someone whose schedule was proceeding perfectly. He placed another call, speaking barely loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Everything's on schedule." "Yes, sir. They're responding exactly as predicted." The conversation lasted 30 seconds, ending with Marcus nodding once and saying, "He'll be here momentarily." Thompson tried to intercept the phone again, but Marcus stepped smoothly away while maintaining eye contact that suggested the manager was being carefully evaluated rather than feared. His composure had shifted from teenage stubbornness to something that made experienced security officers uncomfortable. Rodriguez attempted reasserting control. "Sir, we need to resolve this before departure. Either provide additional verification or accompany us to security." But Marcus was already gathering his papers with methodical precision, every movement deliberate and unhurried, despite time pressure that had everyone else on edge. "Officer, additional verification is arriving shortly. My father expressed interest in observing Atlantic's customer service protocols firsthand." Mills whispered urgently to Thompson, "Brad, Williams Industries just called our corporate hotline asking about discrimination incident protocols and requesting contact information for our legal department. They specifically mentioned Gate A7 and demanded immediate management response." Thompson's face drained color as he realized the scope of what they'd initiated extended far beyond standard passenger disputes. "Final boarding call. Departure in 90 seconds. The gate agent's voice carried over a cabin transformed into an amphitheater of witnesses. Economy passengers pressed against windows trying to glimpse the unfolding drama, while first-class travelers found themselves reluctant participants in what was rapidly escalating beyond simple fraud prevention into corporate crisis territory. Chen made one desperate attempt at damage control. "Look, maybe we can resolve this quietly. If there's been a misunderstanding..." But Marcus interrupted with a gesture so naturally authoritative that the veteran flight attendant actually stopped mid-sentence. "Ms. Morgan, the misunderstanding isn't mine. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the documentation required. The question is whether Atlantic Airlines trains its staff to recognize legitimate customers." Thompson's radio crackled with an emergency call from district headquarters, their voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Brad, we need immediate status on a potential discrimination incident. Corporate legal is fielding calls about social media exposure and demanding full incident reports." The manager stared at Marcus, beginning to understand that the quiet teenager had orchestrated events far more sophisticated than teenage rebellion. Officer Williams approached with newfound caution. "Mr. Williams, perhaps we should wait for additional clarification before proceeding." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's the first sensible suggestion anyone's made, officer. Though I should mention, my father tends to form lasting impressions about organizations based on first encounters. Atlantic Airlines is currently making quite an impression." Aircraft departure delayed pending gate resolution. The announcement triggered frustrated murmurs throughout the passenger cabin, but Marcus seemed satisfied with timing that was apparently proceeding according to his expectations. His phone displayed multiple missed calls from numbers with 202 area codes, Washington, D.C. government and corporate headquarters extensions that suggested influence extending far beyond airline customer service protocols. The live-streaming passenger captured everything while providing running commentary to her expanding audience. "Y'all, this situation just went from discrimination to corporate warfare. This kid's been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers." Her viewer count had tripled as the story gained traction across social media platforms, but Marcus remained focused on something only he could see: a larger game with rules none of them understood yet. Thompson tried one final assertion of authority. "Son, whoever you think you are, company policy applies to everyone equally." Marcus checked his watch again, then looked toward the gate entrance with anticipation that made everyone else turn to follow his gaze. "Mr. Thompson, you're absolutely right about equal treatment. That's exactly what my father wants to discuss with your superiors." 7:05 p.m. Aircraft delayed 18 minutes. The terminal doors swept open and conversations died mid-sentence. David Williams entered like a force of nature in human form, 6'2" of quiet authority in a charcoal suit that whispered power rather than shouting wealth. Two figures flanked him: a woman with a leather portfolio and a man whose understated appearance screamed corporate attorney to anyone who knew the type. Thompson's confidence evaporated instantly. This wasn't an angry parent rushing to rescue his confused kid. This was a boardroom delegation arriving for war, and everyone at Gate A7 had just realized they were unarmed civilians caught in the crossfire. "Marcus!" David's voice carried across the gate area without being raised, and the teenager's entire demeanor transformed. Gone was the isolated boy enduring systematic humiliation. In its place stood someone who'd been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. "Dad, perfect timing. Mr. Thompson was just explaining Atlantic's customer verification policies." Officer Rodriguez instinctively straightened as David approached, recognizing authority that made uniform rankings irrelevant. But David's laser focus locked onto Thompson, whose radio had been shrieking with increasingly frantic headquarters calls. "Mr. Thompson, I'm David Williams. My son tells me you've had questions about his travel arrangements." The manager's mouth worked soundlessly as reality crashed over him in waves. The quiet teenager wasn't some fraud. He was connected to someone whose mere presence made airport security step back automatically. Morgan lurched forward with desperate professionalism. "Mr. Williams, we were simply following standard procedures for unusual documentation situations." "Standard procedures?" David repeated the phrase like he was examining something distasteful under a microscope. The woman beside him opened her portfolio, revealing documents that made Thompson's hands visibly shake. "Mr. Thompson, walk me through these procedures. My legal team finds discrimination protocols fascinating." Marcus moved to stand beside his father, and their similarity was striking. Same analytical eyes, same composed bearing, same ability to command rooms without effort. But where Marcus had shown teenage restraint, David radiated the controlled power of someone who reshaped industries through quiet conversations rather than public battles. "Sir, we were verifying suspicious tickets," Thompson stammered, but his explanation wilted under David's steady gaze. The portfolio revealed contract summaries and partnership agreements that painted a picture none of them wanted to acknowledge. Williams Industries wasn't just another customer. "Thompson," David's voice remained conversational, "do you know what Williams Industries does?" The manager shook his head mutely. "We provide fuel services, ground operations and logistics for Atlantic Airlines, 23 airports, 1,200 employees, $800 million annually. Each fact landed like a physical blow, transforming the suspected fraud in Seat 2A into corporate royalty. Chen's face drained color as she processed the mathematics. $800 million exceeded her entire district's revenue, controlled by the family of the boy she'd been trying to humiliate publicly. Mills clutched her clipboard like a shield, finally understanding why headquarters had been calling with mounting panic about a priority incident. Officer Williams attempted damage control. "Mr. Williams, if we'd understood the corporate relationship—" But David's raised hand stopped the sentence cold. "Officer, that's the problem. My son's treatment shouldn't depend on his last name or bank account. But since you've made it about corporate relationships, let's discuss those." The live-streaming passenger captured everything, her audience exploding as the story gained viral momentum. Her whispered commentary summarized the impossible reversal. "This kid just went from fraud suspect to corporate prince in 30 seconds. His father owns half their business." Marcus spoke quietly, his composure now explained rather than mysterious. "Dad, Mr. Thompson insisted company policies apply equally to everyone. I thought you'd appreciate that commitment to fairness." David's slight smile suggested he understood exactly what his son was communicating about selective policy enforcement. Thompson's radio erupted with another frantic call from headquarters. This time, everyone could hear the panic. "Brad, Williams Industries is demanding an emergency meeting with executive leadership about discrimination. You need a full report immediately." The manager stared at Marcus, realizing the quiet teenager had been orchestrating something far beyond teenage rebellion. "Morgan," David's attention shifted to the flight attendant. "My son explained your concerns about his documentation. Walk me through what made a paid first-class ticket and valid ID seem suspicious." His tone remained pleasant, but Morgan recognized the trap being laid with surgical precision. Unusual circumstances require additional verification," Morgan managed, but her explanation sounded hollow with smartphone footage documenting every discriminatory assumption she'd made. Marcus had legitimate tickets, proper identification, and corporate authorization. The only unusual element was his age and appearance. David nodded thoughtfully. "Unusual circumstances. Marcus has been traveling on business since 15. Corporate ID, documented authorization, established account. Help me understand what seemed unusual." The question hung in recycled air as everyone processed the uncomfortable truth they'd been avoiding. "Mr. Williams," Thompson tried desperately, "we had no way of knowing about the family connection." But David cut him off with devastating politeness. "Thompson, you're missing the point. My son shouldn't need family connections to receive basic human dignity. But since you've made this about business relationships, let's examine Atlantic's dependence on Williams Industries." The attorney stepped forward with tablet precision. "Atlantic Airlines requires Williams Industries for 67% of East Coast operations. Our fuel contracts supply their premium aviation fuel exclusively. Terminating this partnership would require complete operational restructuring across multiple states." The mathematics were catastrophic. Atlantic didn't just serve Williams Industries, they were structurally dependent on Williams operations for survival. Marcus had endured 20 minutes of systematic humiliation not through powerlessness, but as calculated documentation of institutional bias. Every smartphone recording, every discriminatory comment, every assumption based on his appearance had been carefully preserved as evidence of exactly how Atlantic Airlines treated customers who didn't match their expectations. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Mr. Williams, we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." But David wasn't accepting apologies that missed the fundamental issue. "Officer, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling documented in real time by multiple witnesses. My son was discriminated against because a black teenager in first class contradicted your assumptions about who belongs there." The explicit acknowledgement hit like a thunderclap. For 20 minutes, Everyone had danced around the obvious truth. Marcus had been targeted not for suspicious behavior or documentation problems, but because his appearance didn't match their mental image of legitimate first-class passengers. The discrimination had been blatant and systematic, captured on multiple devices for the world to see. Thompson's phone rang with a call that made his face go white. David smiled pleasantly. "That's probably my attorney calling your legal department about Atlantic's bias training protocols. He's very thorough about documenting discrimination incidents involving our personnel." Chen tried one final desperate justification. "We were protecting the airline from potential fraud." But her words died as she realized how they sounded. Protecting the airline from a well-dressed teenager with legitimate documentation and corporate authorization? The explanation revealed more about her assumptions than about Marcus's behavior. Marcus gathered his papers with quiet satisfaction, no longer the isolated victim, but someone whose ordeal had been strategic documentation of systemic problems. His father's arrival hadn't rescued him. It had revealed that he'd never needed rescuing. He'd been collecting evidence while everyone else thought they were wielding power. David's final observation was delivered with boardroom precision. Marcus wanted to attend his grandmother's funeral and conduct business for our family company. Instead, he documented how Atlantic Airlines treats black passengers in real time, with multiple witnesses recording every discriminatory interaction. Tomorrow, this footage will be evidence in discussions about whether Williams Industries continues our $800 million partnership with an organization that profiles our executives based on race. The teenager who'd been surrounded by security guards now stood beside legal counsel and economic leverage that could reshape airline policies through financial pressure rather than public protests. The power dynamic hadn't shifted. It had been completely inverted, revealing that Marcus had been in control from the moment he'd sat down in seat 2A. 7:23 p.m. VIP conference room, Terminal C. Atlantic Airlines Regional Director Rebecca Hayes arrived breathless. Her usually perfect composure cracked like thin ice under pressure. She'd sprinted from the executive parking garage after receiving 3 consecutive calls, one from corporate legal, one from the CEO's office, and one from a board member whose voice carried the kind of panic that ended careers overnight. David Williams sat at the head of the polished conference table with the casual authority of someone who'd chaired 1,000 such meetings. Marcus occupied the seat to his right, no longer the harassed teenager from Gate A7, but a composed young executive reviewing documents with practiced efficiency. The attorney had spread contracts across the mahogany surface like a general planning battlefield strategy. "Ms. Hayes," David's greeting was polite ice. "Thank you for joining us so promptly. I believe we have some customer service issues to discuss." Hayes took her seat carefully, acutely aware that every word would be scrutinized by legal teams on both sides. The room's atmosphere felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided and only the sentencing remained. Hayes opened with damage control diplomacy. "Mr. Williams, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience your son experienced. Our staff clearly mishandled the situation, and we take full responsibility." But David's expression suggested apologies were insufficient for the systematic humiliation Marcus had endured in front of hundreds of witnesses and recording devices. "Inconvenience," David repeated the word with surgical precision. "Ms. Hayes, let's examine exactly what occurred. Marcus presented valid identification, legitimate tickets purchased through our established corporate account, and proper authorization for business travel. Your staff responded by assuming fraud, calling security, and attempting to remove him from the aircraft based solely on his age and appearance." Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice carrying quiet authority that made Hayes lean forward attentively. "Ms. Hayes, I've traveled on Atlantic Airlines 43 times in the past 2 years. This was the first time anyone questioned my documentation or suggested I didn't belong in first class. The variable that changed today wasn't my tickets, my behavior, or my authorization. It was the flight crew's assumptions about black teenagers in premium cabins. The explicit acknowledgement of racial profiling hung in climate-controlled air like smoke from a fired gun. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, recognizing legal quicksand that could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations. Marcus, I understand your frustration, but our staff follows protocols designed to protect all passengers. Her explanation trailed off as she realized how hollow it sounded. David opened his tablet, displaying financial data that made Hayes' stomach clench. Williams Industries currently maintains contracts totaling $847 million annually with Atlantic Airlines. We provide exclusive fuel services to 23 airports, ground operations employing 1,200 personnel, and logistics coordination for 67% of your East Coast flights. Each number was a countdown to economic devastation if their partnership dissolved. The attorney slid a document across the table with the precision of someone playing a winning chess move. This is Williams Industries' current contract portfolio with Atlantic Airlines. Note the termination clauses. Either party may dissolve agreements with 30 days' notice for breach of service standards or discrimination violations. Hayes read quickly, her face growing paler with each paragraph detailing the financial catastrophe that contract termination would trigger. Marcus continued with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truths. Ms. Hayes, Atlantic Airlines processed 12,000 passengers through first class last month. How many were black teenagers traveling alone on corporate business? Your crew's reaction suggests the answer is close to zero, which raises questions about your diversity training and bias recognition protocols. Hayes attempted corporate deflection. We absolutely prohibit discrimination and require sensitivity training for all customer-facing personnel. But David interrupted with boardroom efficiency. Ms. Hayes, good intentions documented in policy manuals mean nothing when staff systematically profile customers based on racial assumptions. Marcus's treatment today wasn't an isolated incident. It was predictable behavior from undertrained employees operating with unconscious bias. The room's dynamics had crystallized into corporate negotiation rather than parental complaint. David wasn't seeking apologies or individual accountability. He was leveraging $800 million in annual contracts to force systemic change across Atlantic's entire operation. Hayes recognized the difference between damage control and fundamental restructuring of company policies. Marcus revealed the strategic depth of their position. Dad, should we discuss the expansion proposal? I brought the West Coast partnership terms like you requested. David smiled approvingly as Marcus produced documents that made Hayes' eyes widen with desperate hunger. Williams Industries was considering doubling their Atlantic Airlines partnership, extending operations to include California, Nevada, and Arizona markets worth potentially another $1 billion annually. The West Coast expansion, David explained casually, depends entirely on Atlantic's commitment to inclusive customer service. We can't partner with organizations that systematically discriminate against our executives based on racial profiling. Today's incident raises serious questions about Atlantic's cultural readiness for expanded collaboration with minority-owned businesses. Hayes realized she was witnessing corporate warfare disguised as customer service discussion. The Williams family hadn't arrived seeking individual redress. They'd orchestrated a comprehensive evaluation of Atlantic's institutional bias, using Marcus's documented humiliation as leverage for industry-wide policy reform. The teenager's ordeal had been strategic collection of evidence rather than random victimization. The attorney presented a tablet displaying social media metrics that made Hayes flinch. Current viral reach exceeds 200,000 shares across multiple platforms. Hashtag Atlantic Airlines bias is trending nationally, with major news outlets requesting interviews about systemic discrimination in premium travel services. The story's trajectory suggests continued growth unless Atlantic demonstrates immediate substantive policy changes. David leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone delivering ultimatums. Ms. Hayes, Williams Industries has prepared 3 options for Atlantic Airlines. Option 1, immediate termination of all existing contracts, effective in 30 days. Option 2, comprehensive diversity training, bias recognition protocols, independent oversight committee, and public accountability measures. Option 3, we escalate this to your board of directors and federal authorities while simultaneously terminating our partnership. The mathematics were devastatingly simple. Option 1 meant Atlantic would lose 67% of East Coast ground operations and exclusive fuel supplies, triggering operational chaos and potential bankruptcy within months. Option 3, combined economic devastation with federal investigation and permanent reputation damage. Option 2 offered survival through systematic reform that would fundamentally reshape how Atlantic treated minority customers. Marcus added the personal element that transformed corporate negotiation into moral imperative. Ms. Hayes, I wanted to fly to my grandmother's funeral with dignity. Instead, I documented how your airline treats black passengers when they think no one important is watching. Tomorrow's board meeting will include this footage and discussion about whether Williams Industries can maintain partnerships with organizations that systematically humiliate our family members. Hayes understood that individual apologies couldn't address institutional problems requiring structural solutions. Mr. Williams, if we implemented comprehensive bias training and oversight protocols, would Williams Industries consider maintaining our partnership? Her question revealed complete capitulation disguised as negotiation. David's response carried boardroom finality. Ms. Hayes, comprehensive reform isn't negotiable. It's the minimum requirement for continued business relationship. The question is whether Atlantic Airlines chooses evolution through partnership or dissolution through discrimination. Marcus documented systemic bias that affects thousands of minority passengers annually. Addressing his individual treatment while ignoring institutional problems would be corporate malpractice. The conference room had become a laboratory for economic leverage applied to social justice. Marcus's documented humiliation had been transformed into irrefutable evidence of racial profiling, backed by $800 million in annual contracts and potential expansion worth another $1 billion. Atlantic Airlines could choose transformation or termination, but continuing discriminatory practices was no longer economically viable. Hayes recognized that corporate survival required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about institutional bias. Mr. Williams Marcus, you have our commitment to immediate policy review and comprehensive staff retraining. What specific measures would demonstrate Atlantic's serious commitment to inclusive customer service? Her question marked complete surrender disguised as collaborative problem-solving. The teenager who'd been humiliated at Gate A7 now sat across from a regional director whose company's survival depended on his family's continued partnership. Economic leverage had transformed documented discrimination into corporate policy reform, proving that systematic change sometimes required financial pressure rather than moral persuasion. Marcus had endured public humiliation to collect evidence that his father was now using to reshape an entire airline's approach to minority customers. 72 hours later, Atlantic Airlines corporate headquarters. The press release went live at exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, distributed simultaneously across every major news platform and social media channel. Rebecca Hayes stood behind a podium bearing the Atlantic Airlines logo, flanked by diversity consultants and legal advisors whose presence testified to the systematic overhaul now underway. Atlantic Airlines acknowledges that our customer service protocols failed Marcus Williams and countless other passengers who deserved better treatment. Hayes read from prepared remarks that had been reviewed by Williams Industries' legal team. We take full responsibility for discriminatory practices that contradict our stated values of inclusive service excellence. The carefully crafted apology avoided legal admissions while accepting moral accountability for institutional bias. Marcus watched the live stream from his father's office, noting how Hayes emphasized systematic review and comprehensive reform rather than individual accountability. Brad Thompson had been suspended pending investigation, while Sarah Morgan was reassigned to ground services with mandatory bias recognition training. The crew's individual consequences mattered less than the policy changes their actions had triggered across Atlantic's entire operation. David Williams appeared on the split-screen broadcast via video conference, his presence lending credibility to Atlantic's reform promises. Williams Industries believes in redemption through action, rather than condemnation through rhetoric. he stated with diplomatic precision. Atlantic Airlines has committed to measurable changes that will benefit minority passengers system-wide, not just high-profile customers with corporate leverage. The reforms announced were comprehensive and unprecedented in airline industry history. The Williams Protocol established real-time bias reporting systems allowing passengers to document discrimination via mobile app, with incidents automatically escalated to corporate oversight committees rather than gate-level management. Every customer-facing employee would complete quarterly sensitivity training designed by diversity experts rather than legal compliance officers. Hayes continued reading specifics that demonstrated Atlantic's serious commitment to institutional change. Independent monitors will conduct quarterly assessments of passenger treatment across demographic categories, with results published publicly on our website. Any employee demonstrating pattern discrimination will face immediate termination, regardless of seniority or performance in other areas. The transparency requirements would make future bias incidents impossible to ignore or suppress. Marcus had requested one specific reform that resonated beyond airline operations. Atlantic Airlines would sponsor annual scholarships for minority students pursuing aviation careers, administered through historically black colleges and universities. The best way to prevent discrimination, Marcus had told Hayes during negotiations, is ensuring decision-makers reflect the diversity of customers they serve. The scholarship program would fund the next generation of minority pilots, mechanics, and executives. The financial commitment was substantial. $50,000 donated to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Marcus's name, plus ongoing scholarship funding and independent oversight costs that exceeded $2 million annually. But compared to losing Williams Industries' $800 million partnership, the investment in systemic reform represented sound business strategy disguised as social responsibility. Social media response was overwhelmingly positive, with passengers sharing their own discrimination experiences while praising Atlantic's comprehensive accountability measures. The #Williams Protocol became shorthand for using economic leverage to force institutional change, inspiring similar campaigns targeting other service industries where minority customers faced systematic bias. Thompson's termination letter arrived by certified mail, citing violation of customer service standards and failure to recognize unconscious bias in passenger interactions. His career in airline management ended not through criminal prosecution but through corporate accountability that made discrimination economically unsustainable. Morgan's reassignment included psychological evaluation and extensive retraining designed to address underlying assumptions about passenger demographics. Officer Williams, whose surname coincidence had provided ironic commentary throughout the incident, was selected to lead airport security's new bias recognition training program. His experience witnessing systematic discrimination firsthand made him an effective advocate for treating all passengers with professional respect, regardless of age, race, or perceived social status. The training emphasized that legitimate authority comes from behavior and documentation, not appearance or assumptions. Marcus returned to Atlanta for his grandmother's funeral, this time traveling without incident on the same route where he'd been humiliated weeks earlier. Flight attendants recognized him immediately, their respectful service demonstrating how quickly institutional culture could change when economic incentives aligned with moral imperatives. The teenager who'd been profiled as suspicious fraud now received treatment befitting someone whose family's business relationship kept their company operational. The broader impact extended far beyond Atlantic Airlines as other major carriers quietly reviewed their own bias training protocols, recognizing that demographic shifts in passenger populations required corresponding evolution in customer service approaches. Marcus's documented humiliation had become a case study in business schools nationwide, demonstrating how systematic discrimination could trigger economic consequences that forced institutional reform more effectively than legal protests. Williams Industries expanded their Atlantic Airlines partnership to include West Coast operations worth $1.2 billion annually, validating their approach of requiring accountability before increasing investment. The economic leverage that had transformed Marcus's humiliation into industry-wide policy reform now funded expansion that would create thousands of jobs while maintaining strict diversity and inclusion standards. The quiet teenager who'd endured public discrimination had achieved something remarkable: systematic change through strategic documentation and economic pressure rather than media campaigns or legal battles. His ordeal had been transformed into evidence that institutional bias was economically unsustainable when customers possessed sufficient leverage to demand better treatment. 6 months later, Harvard Business School case study presentation. Marcus Williams stood before 200 graduate students, his presentation titled Economic Leverage in Corporate Social Responsibility, the Atlantic Airlines Case. The same teenager who'd been humiliated at Gate A7 now taught future business leaders how systematic discrimination could be transformed into institutional reform through strategic documentation and financial pressure. The key wasn't proving we were right, Marcus explained to the engaged audience, but making bias economically unsustainable. Atlantic Airlines changed policies not because discrimination was morally wrong, but because continuing discriminatory practices would have cost them $800 million annually. His analysis was clinical, focusing on leverage mechanics rather than emotional appeals for justice. David Williams had been invited to speak at the Federal Aviation Administration's annual diversity conference, where his presentation on corporate partnership standards for inclusive service became mandatory viewing for airline executives nationwide. The Williams Protocol had been adopted by 6 major carriers within 4 months, creating industry-wide standards for bias recognition and passenger treatment that extended far beyond Atlantic's initial reforms. Marcus graduated valedictorian from his preparatory academy, his Harvard acceptance letter citing both academic excellence and demonstrated leadership in corporate social responsibility. His essay about transforming personal discrimination into systematic institutional change resonated with admissions committees seeking students who could leverage privilege for broader social impact rather than individual advancement. The documentary First Class Citizen premiered at Sundance Film Festival, featuring smartphone footage from that day at Gate A7 alongside interviews with passengers, crew members, and corporate executives. Marcus's calm demeanor during systematic humiliation contrasted sharply with the institutional panic that followed, creating powerful commentary about how economic leverage could force accountability more effectively than moral persuasion alone. Atlantic Airlines became an industry leader in diversity training. Their comprehensive bias recognition protocols, studied by corporations across multiple sectors, seeking to avoid similar economic consequences for discriminatory practices. Rebecca Hayes received promotion to Vice President of Customer Experience, her career advancement directly tied to successfully implementing reforms that prevented future discrimination incidents. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History acquired artifacts from the incident: Marcus's boarding pass, Thompson's termination letter, and printed screenshots of the viral social media coverage that had amplified the story internationally. These materials joined exhibits documenting how economic power could be strategically deployed to advance civil rights through corporate accountability, rather than traditional protest movements. Marcus's approach inspired a new generation of activists who understood that systematic change often required financial leverage rather than moral arguments alone. Young people across the country began documenting discrimination incidents with the strategic precision of someone collecting evidence for corporate negotiations rather than social media campaigns. These real-life stories matter because they demonstrate how Black stories continue shaping corporate America through economic pressure rather than emotional appeals. When touching stories like Marcus's inspire systematic policy changes, entire industries evolve to serve customers more equitably. Have you witnessed discrimination in travel, retail, or professional settings? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story opened your eyes to how strategic documentation can transform individual humiliation into institutional reform, subscribe for more content about using economic leverage for social justice. Your voice and your wallet both matter. Use them strategically to demand the respect every customer deserves, regardless of age, race, or perceived social status.